Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report. I'm Melina Weiskup. Passing the annual National Defense Authorization Act today, Republicans hailing it as a win, since they included amendments that push back against the Biden administration's social policies in the Pentagon.
The House on Friday approved the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024 with a vote of 219 to 210. The budget bill authorizes $886 billion for national defense programs, as well as a 5.2% pay raise for service members, the largest in decades.
Just focus on the military. Stop using taxpayer money to do their own wokeism. A military cannot defend themselves if you train them in woke. We don't want Disneyland to train our military. We want our men and women in the military to have every defense possible.
Lawmakers approved amendments that reverse the Biden administration's social policies in the Pentagon. These include banning the Pentagon from paying for or reimbursing service members for abortions, banning the military's health plan from covering gender transition procedures, and banning diversity, equity, and inclusion training within the military. Members of the House Freedom Caucus were behind many of the amendments. They hail the passage of the bill as a victory.
The House Freedom Caucus, America's Freedom Caucus, is never going to stop to making every single bill that gets out of here as the best it can be, the most righteous it can be, and the best for America.
The Defense Authorization Act is a critical must-pass bill that usually enjoys widespread bipartisan support, but this time it passed largely along party lines. The 4 Republican House members who voted against the bill were Andy Biggs and Eli Crane of Arizona, Ken Buck of Colorado, and Tom Massey of Kentucky. The 4 Democratic House members who voted for the bill were Jared Golden of Maine, Donald Davis of North Carolina, Gabriel Vasquez of New Mexico, and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez of Washington. The House Democratic leadership offered their reaction to the bill.
It is woefully irresponsible that extreme MAGA Republicans have hijacked a bipartisan bill that is essential to our national security and taken it over and weaponized it in order to jam their extreme right-wing ideology down the throats of the American people.
The Democrat-controlled Senate is expected to begin consideration of its own version of the Defense Authorization Act next week. An initial procedural vote to take up the bill could come next Tuesday. The House version of the bill will need to be reconciled with whatever the Senate passes. Reporting by Allison Lee, NTD News.
Giving it another try. The Biden administration has a new plan to cancel nearly $40 billion of student loans. It comes after the High Court, of course, struck down its original idea. NTD's Iris Tao has more.
The Biden administration now plans to cancel $39 billion in student debt for over 800,000 borrowers. The Friday announcement comes after the Supreme Court just weeks ago struck down President Biden's $400 billion student loan cancellation plan. And Biden reacted to the decision then by vowing,
"Today's decision has closed one path. Now we're going to pursue another."
And now the administration says there were historical inaccuracies in how borrowers' monthly payments toward their student loan are counted. And by fixing the system, it says some 800,000 borrowers will see their debt wiped away in the coming weeks. But Republicans fire back. GOP Senator Eric Schmidt called it another student loan debt bailout scheme. And Republican Congresswoman Virginia Foxx said it was a blatantly political attempt to circumvent the Supreme Court.
Was much more likely to stand up.
But Ryan York, a senior research faculty at the American Institute for Economic Research, told me that this plan was a lot narrower.
Rather than being wholesale forgiveness for a wide swath of borrowers, it instead narrowly uses the regulations that already exist about income-driven repayment plans. I think the courts will be less likely to view it as an overreach by the Department of Education.
And I asked,
let's say that it does get through. What kind of impact do you think it's going to have on the economy?
Well, it's less than 10% of the initial forgiveness. I don't think there'll be a lot of effect economically on.
The High Court struck down President Biden's original plan, saying its political and economic impact would be staggering. Though it's unclear whether the new plan will be challenged legally, it does need to wait for a public comment period before it could go into effect. Reporting by Iris Tao, NTD News.
So what's it like doing business in China? Is there a price to pay for prospering under the shadow of the communist state? 3 business leaders sat down with lawmakers during a congressional hearing last night, breaking down the reality of China's economy. NTD's Sam Wong brings us more from the Capitol.
We're out here on Capitol Hill where several business leaders testified before a panel of lawmakers on Thursday night. And they're urging U.S. business leaders to watch out before they put a dime into China's economy. Watch.
I would like to recount 3 personal stories that illustrate the essence of doing business in China.
This is Desmond Shum, one of the most well-connected billionaires in China. In the 1990s, Shum and his ex-wife built a multi-billion-dollar property development company from scratch, using their connection with high-ranking Chinese officials. But the real estate magnate took off from China in 2015, just when the regime's leadership began to impose greater state control over the nation's businesses. Shum's ex-wife disappeared 2 years later. It is believed that she was held captive by the CCP officials. But according to Shum, she was never charged for any crime. Speaking to the U.S. House Select Committee on the CCP, here's what he summed up in a nutshell.
My lesson: in China, there's no such a thing as a level playing field. You either prosper when favored by the state, or you perish when you are not.
Sitting next to Shum is Shahzad Kazi. He is the chief operating officer of China Beige Book, an advisory firm offering data analysis on the Chinese economy. Kazi said that the constrained information environment inside China is making investments there increasingly less reliable. So what is the current status quo of China's economy? Is it doing pretty well, or is it heading down a slippery slope? I spoke with Mr. Kazi on the ground, and here's what he told me. Watch.
At the beginning of the year, you had all these banks on Wall Street claiming that this was going to be the year of a bombastic recovery in China. And so the street sold investors this magical China growth story that was not based on any reality. What that's done is since then there's been a massive market sell-off, a lot of weakness in China.
Given all the risks involved in China, what will it take for business leaders to send their investments elsewhere? Mike Gallagher, chairman of the committee, told me that the purpose of this hearing was to raise awareness for U.S. investors. But he also noted that it is ultimately going to require legislative action.
Passing legislation on restricting the flow of U.S. capital to China, outbound capital, guardrails, I think is of paramount importance. It's something I think we need to do in the 118th Congress.
Reporting from Capitol Hill, Sam Wong, NTD News.
And a topic of concern on Capitol Hill is the emergence of ESG investing. That is environmental, social, and corporate governance. Our next guest recently had a deep dive into ESG and how it is reshaping the business world around us. For example, if you plan to own a small farm or a gun store, it may become increasingly difficult to get investment or insurance. Business reporter, film producer, and former Wall Street banker Kevin Stocklin helps us to understand the real-world impacts of ESG. Joining me now is Kevin Stocklin, who is a business reporter, and he recently produced a documentary investigating the ESG industry. That documentary is called The Shadow State. It's actually on the Epoch Times' website. Kevin, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me on.
Of course. So we're going to talk about ESG, of course. First of all, just the basics. How widespread is its use in the U.S. and abroad, and what are its main impacts overall from what you've discovered in your research?
Well, it's an enormous industry. It has tens of trillions of dollars supporting it, and virtually every company is touched by ESG or influenced by ESG in some way, whether that's through their climate policies or their race or gender equity policies. There's very few corporations that you can point to today that aren't implementing some form of ESG policy. In terms of how it manifests itself in companies, this would manifest itself in terms of hiring quotas, quotas for board members, and then any messaging that they do. It's why Disney, for example, fought parents' rights laws in Florida. It's why Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines fought voter ID laws in Georgia because they considered them racist, even though the vast majority of every racial group supported having voter ID. So there's various ways that this will manifest itself. Also, anyone who has had to go undergo a DEI training program, diversity, equity, inclusion training program through their corporate employer, the roots of that are in ESG as well.
And lastly, I want to go into what Congress has done so far to kind of analyze the impacts that this has had here in the U.S. They had multiple hearings this week, the Financial Services Committee. One topic that they were discussing was how ESG actually impacts markets. So from your perspective, how does ESG distort markets and raise specifically insurance and housing costs?
Well, what people need to understand is that we're in a new era of investment. So there was a time decades ago when if we wanted to save, we would buy shares in a company. Today, we buy shares through mutual funds, pension funds, index funds, things like this. So we now have these intermediaries between us and the actual corporations. And the way that ESG is able to control these companies is they have the shareholder vote. So we don't have that vote. The owners of the pension funds, they are the ones who are able to vote those shares. And we've seen a tremendous concentration in a small number of firms. Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street are the three largest, and together they control nearly $20 trillion worth of assets. And they are the largest shareholders in about 90% of the S&P 500. So using really our money, retail investors' money, they now have tremendous power to control the corporate sector, and that's what they're doing. They're doing also their shareholders in banks, their shareholders in insurance companies, and they are really able to dictate what these companies do, and they have been pressuring them to pursue a lot of these ESG goals.
And how would that down the line impact everyday Americans?
You could see, for example, banks that may be less willing to invest in polluting companies and these so-called brown companies that are fossil fuel companies. But on a smaller scale, it could impact their ability to extend credit to farms if these farms are considered to be polluting because they have livestock or cows or whatever. As far as insurance companies, it may be more difficult for certain companies or family farms as well to get insurance because they are deemed to be polluting, and because a lot of these banks and insurance companies have signed on to these global clubs, Climate Action 100 or Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance or Net Zero Insurance Alliance or whatever, in which they pledge to reduce the use of fossil fuels throughout their portfolios. So it's definitely affecting the big companies, but it could go all the way down to small mom and pop organizations as well. Another area that they hate is firearms. So a lot of firearms dealers are also family owned, and we are seeing a significant investment that they won't provide credit or insurance to these companies either. So it's really making its way all the way down to everyday people's lives.
Okay, thank you for that thorough analysis. We really appreciate your time, Kevin. Kevin Stocklin, we appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.